You're listening to the Sketchnote Army podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rohde, the author of the Sketchnote Handbook and the Sketchnote Workbook, and this is the podcast where I chat with sketchnoters and visual thinkers and try to understand what makes them tick. Hey, Mike Rohde here. I'm teaming up with Peachpit to give away 10 prizes in the Sketchnote Handbook 10th birthday giveaway. It's easy to enter the giveaway. First, you follow Peachpit and Rohde on Twitter. Second, retweet at least one Sketchnote 10th birthday tweet from Peachpit or Rohde. And here are the 10 prizes you could win. 1 coaching session with me for 30 minutes. 3 signed 10th birthday edition Sketchnote Handbooks. 3 Sketchnote Ideabooks and Airship Autoquill Fineliner 6-pack pens as a set. And 3 Sketchnote typeface full desktop licenses. Visit rohdesign.com/giveaway to see all the details. This contest runs from November 1st to November 30th, 2022, and is open to U.S. adults only. Entries must be received by 11:59 p.m. Eastern, November 30th, 2022, and winners will be announced on December 1st, 2022. See official rules at peachpit.com/happy10. That's peachpit.com/happy10. And now, on with the show. Hey everyone, this is Mike Rohde, and I'm here with Kate Rutter. Kate, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you.
It is exciting to be here. Longtime listener, first-time guest.
Exactly. And we were talking a little bit before we began that we first met back in like 2010, 2011, somewhere in that neighborhood at South by Southwest in Austin. Like before it was super popular. Like this is the early days. We were sort of like, I guess, trendsetters. I don't know. And we met in the big lobby and we were showing each other, like you had your sketchbooks and I had my stuff. And we were just kind of geeking out on like visual thinking and sketchnoting. And I just remember that as being a really fun, like, oh, Kate was so cool as I walked away. And then we've sort of maintained connection over the many years because of that, I think.
Yeah, I can't recall exactly when I first learned about your sketchnoting practice, probably because of your South by Southwest work, which was, had such a big impact, and seeing your work and being like, oh my gosh, he's doing that too. And there was an upwelling, I think, of visual note-taking, but the catalyst of having a really good word and phrase, and it was right before your book came out. And, we knew that it just had a sizzle in the air, that something was afoot. And now, 10, 12 years later, to see the bounty that it's resulted in is just exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited by that too, and it's fun to see where it's come from. Oddly enough, this year is the 10th anniversary of my book, The Sketchnote Handbook. Crazy, huh?
Congratulations. Wow.
Yeah. That's fun. It's fun to see that and see the impact that it's had. So I know you, but other people may not know you. So let's get this started. And my first question is always, who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So my name is Kate Rutter. I live in Emeryville, California, which is nestled between Berkeley and Oakland, if you know the area, kind of at the crotch of the east of the Bay Bridge. And I've spent my time kind of jigging and jagging between technology and visual note-taking types of things, but also some elements of art. So that's where I've been. I settled my career for about the last couple of decades on user experience design, and did, startup work with that. And then also a consultancy named Adaptive Path, which was very pioneered a lot of that field early on, and then moved into entrepreneurship and co-founded a startup and the lean startup ethos a few years ago, and then moved into education. So both for a startup program helping people with existing careers move into UX work and product design work, but then most recently at California College of the Arts, where I've been an adjunct faculty member for about 5 years, working with the next generation of product thinkers, designers, etc. So anytime there's a one leg in technology and one leg in design, and probably the third stool leg, if you're a stool, not a person, in human care and empathy and service, real service to humans, that's where I have grounded my career. And I'll tell you how that's shifting later on when we talk about where things are now.
Oh, that sounds good.
That's what I've been doing for the last 20 or so years.
Well, that's great to hear. It's a similar space where I am, similar kind of things I'm interested in. combining. I've always been a combo person. I always had computers and art or computers and design mixed together in some way. So I can relate, which is great to see. Great to have a fellow traveler in that space. So tell us, how you ended up where you are now? Maybe like when you were a little girl. What were you like when you were a little girl? How did that impact, and what did that story look like to get you to where you are now?
Sure, that's funny. I won't go into too much. I was kind of bossy and annoying as a little kid, but I also had a pretty rambunctious imagination, and I loved spending time alone. And there's something about that. I ended up making a lot of imaginary worlds by drawing them. So there was always a very heavy sketching, drawing enjoyment in my life. But then, I got to high school. There's a very clear moment of this. I got to high school and I was taking notes. My handwriting legibility was always kind of really crappy, and didn't like my handwriting. It was sprawly. So in high school, when I was taking notes, they were hard to read, they were ugly, they were annoying, and they were took up a lot of pages. I finally just said, well, if I can't make sense of this live synthesis as I want to, and actually not just write down what was being said, but what I was thinking about being said, then I should just collapse it all down. And I literally became the wall of text note taker. I wrote everything just line after line after line. If there was a difference between the ideas, I'd put a dot there. And so my notes were absolutely the thing that Sketchnote, I think, avoids, which is the wall of text. And that got me through high school, and most of college. But then when I came out of that world and I was working, I had an opportunity to play around with the computer, got into desktop, computing at that point. And that was kind of more graphic design, and then fell in love with the technology. Like you said, the visual and the technology are like two great tastes, taste great together. And I ended up really skewing heavily into the networking and technology side, became a sysadmin, where really the visual language is symbology, right? It's symbols about, network topology and communications and all of that. And so I got very adept at more abstract diagrammatic types of things. And then I was the director of technology for a nonprofit, and we were going through a strategic shift. And we brought in the Grove consultants, which is David Sibbett, and really graphic recording and graphic facilitation, which was a way of visualizing human interactions and content that I had I'd never thought of that before. I'd always kind of had like hints and weird explorations with visual note taking, but this was a real practice. And it was a practice with methods and tools and a community. And my heart was aflame. That was probably like 1996. And so graphic facilitation and recording it felt like a big method. There's a lot of just big thinking around that. But what I really loved was then when I went to Adaptive Path was bringing that thinking down small again. So using some of those techniques as a personal note-taking practice, as a way to communicate with clients, as drawing on the whiteboard. Whiteboard Warrior is a course that Molly Claire Wilson created at Stanford, and people really responded to that. So this visual communication as a real boundary object between trying to get humans to understand each other. That's where I really was excited about it. And that's kind of the state of my practice now. And that's where the sketch notes, I mean, I don't want to be too like, yay, Mike, but yay, Mike, because giving the community a word, a concept that can really start to accrue around it has been such a catalyst. Really exciting. And it's taken that like graphic recording, graphic facilitation, which are slightly different, more group oriented practices, and really personalized it down and made it much more accessible. So that's the kind of work I love doing.
Wow, that's really cool. It's fun to hear the progression from where you began and where you are now. The wall of text is interesting because I was doing the same thing, and that's what convinced me to try the sketchnoting as an experiment. Because I was writing walls of text in a big book with pencil. And I didn't want to go back through that stuff because who wants to dig through the forest, right? So that forced me to say, okay, there's got to be a better way. What if I just take this little notebook and a pen and try that? Like maybe I was even at a point of desperation, like, okay, I can't think of anything else. Well, let's try this. Maybe it'll work, right? And it turned out to be, it definitely worked. And here we are, 15 some years later, still doing it, and it's expanding and growing and international. And so, yeah, I could definitely relate to the wall of text that as soon as you said it, I knew exactly what you meant. Well,
Nice.
so tell us a little bit about, okay, we're now at present day. Tell me something that you're excited about that you're working on right now that you are able to share with us.
Sure. So after all of that deep dive into the world of computing and technology and just the richness, and boy, has that field really grown. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's made products better. I think it's made companies better. Still not 100% as far as user-centered design in companies, but getting there. A lot more openness. But during the pandemic, something very odd happened, and I felt the call of nature. I know that phrase can mean many things, but
Yeah.
after many years of being really inside behind a screen, I don't know what it was, but there was something very fundamental that needed to change. And so
Mm.
I've kind of left that world behind. It's
Mm.
been a slow, sometimes painful transition, but a really exciting one. And I had gotten involved with a community called the Nature Journaling Community before the pandemic. There's a variety of sketch groups that I kind of convene and lead in the Bay Area. Um, and the nature journaling community came up, and it's really sketchnoting for nature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's the nature of it. It's observational drawing, which is very different, I think, from a traditional sketchnoting practice.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also annotations, it's observations, and it's a way of connecting with the natural world that is distinct from botanical illustration. It's distinct from scientific illustration. It's its own personal practice, very much in the same way the sketchnotes is an informational practice. Nature journaling is an observational practice. I call it documented curiosity
Hmm.
more than art.
That's an interesting term.
And so I got more involved with that group, and then during the pandemic, that was really what gave solace and comfort and connection and mental health during a very very hard time. Uh, and I think that was the entry into thinking about what life could look like living outdoors instead of indoors. So trading screens for greens. And since
Mm.
then, I've been my job this year has to be get informed and educated about the climate issues around what
Mm.
it takes to care for natural restoration for habitats, what it takes to grow things, both food as well as more decorative or
Mm.
spirit enlivening types of plants. I'm super into plants. I mean, animals
Mm.
are great, bugs are awesome, but I'm super into plants. So that's where I spend most of my visual practice now, is that. And I tell you, having taught sketchnoting, because in a design curriculum, teaching sketchnoting as a way of teaching note taking is
Mm-hmm.
really amazing, and students have always very much well responded to that. Um, but being a student myself and using sketchnoting to learn in depth about these very very not esoteric but super precise topics in science and in climate and in ecosystems, there's a lot of knowledge out there, words I've never
Mm.
heard of before. Using sketchnoting as a lens to learn that has
Mm.
been really fantastic and amazing. So that's kind of the state of my practice right now. Is
Mm.
I'm a permanent learner for a period of time until I can figure out how to bring it all together into a livelihood again.
Mm. Interesting. Well, I think it's good to have these restoration periods where you get to kind of go in the wilderness, literally and figuratively, right, and figure out what it is that the next thing is for you. Um, I know that I've been through a couple of those in my life, and I think it's always important to appreciate them as transitions to the next, whatever that next thing is. Um, and so I'm excited for you that you are able to do this, and I'm excited to see what you're going to come up with on the other side.
Thanks. It's funny. I just got back from a week in the Sierras doing an immersion program to become a certified California naturalist.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so interesting because half of the work that I was working on was nature journaling, observational work in the field, and then half of it was sketchnoting because there were lectures and other
Mm-hmm.
types of things. And to see both of those practices kind of together in the same book was interesting. That's because I often keep my nature journaling work in a separate
Mm-hmm.
sketchbook, and then I have my everyday sketchbook, which is pretty much everything else. And so to see those together, and to hear people respond, like they'd look over my shoulder and say, "Look at your notes." And it's funny, any visual element, whether it's a block text or a stick figure or a block figure, people are always like, "Your notes are so beautiful." And I think they're beautiful because they activate the information
Mm.
in a different way than what might be traditional note taking or word only note taking, wands, word only notes, and so it's just consistently enchanting. And when I mention, hey, have you heard of sketchnoting? There's still a lot of folks who say no,
Yep,
which,
there sure are.
it's everybody's lucky day when that's the answer, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh, look at this thing you can explore.
Yeah, exactly. That's a lot of the reason why I'm really excited when I hear people teaching, like you're talking about teaching sketchnoting. That's exciting for me because that means that the movement itself is growing and active, and that people are so excited about it who have gotten into it themselves that they're willing to teach to other people because they see the value for themselves. That was my initial experience. Was like, holy cow, this is working for me. There has to be at least one other person this could help, if not hundreds. I had no idea if there were more than that at the time, but that was my reaction. Was this is too cool to hide, right? We have to share this. So I'm really glad.
Millions, Mike. There were millions more interested in this. So yay.
Potentially billions.
That's right.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned all this stuff about nature journaling. We've both been involved in the Wild Wonder, which is John Muir Law's event, his yearly event that he puts on. But he has groups as well. And oddly enough, he was a guest on the Sketchnote Army podcast in season 9. One of my favorite episodes. He's like amazing. And he talked a little bit about how he was doing this observational, nature journaling, and then he discovered sketchnoting, and he said it really changed the way he did observational work, where he would look at something and then try to imagine and then sketchnote how did it end up in that place, right? Using his scientific knowledge to kind of guesstimate, and then he would go verify, and like it sort of added a whole dimension to his observational nature journaling, which he was really excited about. So he's been a great support for me. Has invited me to come to the conference for the last 3 years. So we're going to both be at the conference this year, which will be past, I think, by the time this show airs. But really exciting to see this crossover between, two different communities, the sketchnoting community and then nature journaling, and seeing how much they do interact with each other. That's really fun.
It was weird. I met Jack in 2015, another local sketcher, sketch leader, Lori Wiggum, who's a member of many sketch communities and convenes the SF Sketchers, which is more urban sketching, which is, outside the purview of our conversation. But she had put together some people who were leading meetup groups on sketching topics. And I had SF Sketchnotes SF, and Jack had the Nature Journal Club. And I'd never heard of nature journaling as a specific practice. And sketchnotes seemed surprising to him. And so we were talking, and that was the first time I got to meet him. Maybe he knew about sketchnotes before, but it seemed a surprise. So maybe that was where that happened too.
Yeah, it could be.
It would have been 2015. But boy, I tell you, there's just so much commonality. When I think of the sketching practices, and one of the ways that I like to help either nature journalers get into sketchnoting or vice versa is, you can have a visual note-taking practice around observation or information or experiences. And I think that the practical hands-on nature journaling practice is a lot about observational and sketching, and really not replicating life, but being very accurate in what you're looking at is it's a different visual language. And then having a symbolic language or a more abstracted language is where that information sketching comes from. And then imagination, or experiences, you can do all kinds of things with that. But I really think I've noticed a real difference between sketching from observation and sketching from information. And when they come together, it's the magic. I love that.
Yeah, that's really great. That's really great. This episode of the Sketchnote Army podcast is brought to you by Concepts, an infinite, flexible, creative tool for all your good ideas, available on iOS, Windows, and Android. The new Concept 6 for iOS has exciting new features, including a modernized canvas interface, a freshly structured, easier-to-use gallery that integrates with the iOS Files app, and RGB and HSL color options added to its already extensive Copic color palettes. Concept's infinite canvas lets you spread out and sketch in any direction. Draw and take notes with liquid pens, markers, and brushes in your favorite colors. Everything you draw in Concepts is a flexible vector, so you can move your notes around the canvas or change their color, tool, or size with simple gestures. Drag and drop images onto the canvas and use layers and grids to organize your creative space. When you're ready to share, Export straight to your friends or team. Search concepts in your favorite app store for infinite, flexible sketching. Well, I want to shift a little bit so that we're talking about practices and such, about tools. I would love to hear what kind of tools can you share with us. We'll start with analog and switch to digital. You can kind of go crazy because I know you step into nature journaling and there's probably other tools you use there than you might use for sketchnoting. So let's hear it all, and I'm going to put it in the show notes as much as we can find for people that are curious and want to maybe try stepping in their backyard and doing some nature journaling.
Sweet. Yeah. So my first rule of thumb on tools is the best tools are the ones you have with you.
Yeah.
So I just always carry a pen and always in my shirt, in fact. So just, you can always write on your hand if you don't have any paper or napkin or something. But just that. As far as the actual tools that I use, my favorite pen of late is the pen I always carry with me is a Uniball Vision Micro in black, because that's just a good utility pen for anything. The one that I like most now for sketchnoting and nature journaling is the Tombow Fudenosuke. It is a hard tip black brush pen that works, and you can also do washes and watercolor over it, which is part of the practice for my nature journaling work. When I do sketch notes, it's almost always like highlighters, markers, or colored pencils. I don't do as much watercoloring on those because that's just not what I carry with me. As far as highlighters and markers, I'm a big Midliner fan, and I think that's a Zebra brand as well. They're Zebra Midliner, and they're double tipped. So they've got a bold, flat chisel tip, and then they also have a fine tip. And I find the gray marker, which I used to call the God marker, but it's probably a little overblown. I would call it maybe the savior marker instead, is just having a gray marker. There's going to be one color that I use, it's the gray marker, because it just gives lift.
Yeah, it just pops.
It takes something, from something flat to something dimensional. And I think that's the biggest boom for understandability, for focus, for all the things that good sketch notes have. I've recently been getting into fountain pens because I'm kind of done with having disposable pens, but I'm not quite willing to make the jump yet. I've got a Lamy. I've got a Lamy with a nice everyday writing tip, and I'm finding that I really like the fountain pen action. So other than that, I don't really use a lot of fancy materials. For my watercoloring kit, and I'll send you a link, I like using a limited color palette. And I do carry like a little paint box with me, a paint box with a water brush, which holds the water in it so that you don't have to have extra water, and then having a sock on your arm so you can clean your water brush. That is the key for field work. Jack taught me that. John Muir-Laws taught me that. You have a cut off foot of a sock. You wear it like an arm sock. You have your water brush and you have your paint box, and you are good for field watercolor. Wow. It's amazing. So those are the tools. I mean, they're not really fancy, are they? I feel kind of like a little bit like you're whatever, but that is, I like to invest my mental cycles in experimenting with mark making instead of necessarily experimenting with tools. As far as digital tools, I'm such an analog gal. I love the scritchy of like Sharpies on paper. I think Sharpies smell like ideas, and so there's all that. I will say that I have a new digital tool which I use. I've been a Photoshop person for a long time. Not into the whole web-based software thing and licensed subscription. I like a good desktop version, and until they skew back to that, I have abandoned Photoshop. And now I do all of I scan and optimize my work, or photograph and optimize the work so it's crisper, so that it works high resolution if it's going to be published somewhere. And for that I use Acorn, which is a $30 visual, optimizing tool, and I love it. There's some scripting stuff that Photoshop still did better, but overall I find it totally works for my needs. And so I'm glad to be out of that, Adobe cartel for a little while. Still admiration for their products, but I'm not going to go with the live subscription on that one. So that's my digital. I hear a lot about Procreate. I've played with it. Not sure if I want to jump into the iPad world right now. they're just so heavy, and I always carry a sketchbook anyway, so having both. And now
Hmm.
a lot of my work is outside, so
Right.
it's less helpful. I mean, I'm more likely to grab my Write in the Rain, which is
Mm.
the sketchbook you can
Waterproof.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah, it's waterproof and use pencil, and it works great in downpours. I'm more likely to do that than to bring in an iPad.
Mm. Just sounds like for your needs and the way you work, it's just not practical,
Yeah.
which is always the right choice, right? Like you just have to go with what's working, which is the same thing with your tools. Like I'm like you, I like to have tools that I can go to the Walgreens or the grocery store anywhere in the world and probably find a replacement or something equivalent.
Yeah.
So I sort of trained myself to work with these basic tools to make interesting things because it's easy to get, but it also reminds you that it's not about the tools. As much as we like to talk about them, ultimately it's the person running the tools because, you know, the same thing said about cameras. Like some of the most amazing photography in the world were done with really basic film cameras in black and white, right? So it really, really can be done. And it's good to hear that you're focusing on production and not so worried about the tools that you use.
Yeah, there is one good tool story because you talk a lot about experimentation, and that's one of the principles I have. I mean, I make a lot of weird stuff, and I make sketch notes that I am just not excited about the outcome or the result. That's not why I'm in it, so it's a
Yeah.
little less painful. But I tell you, my philosophy has been when I'm making weird or unfortunate work, I try and bury it with better work. Right? Like don't pull it back and not share it. It's just try and keep moving enough fast enough that the work actually improves because pencil miles, as we call it in kind of the nature journaling community, is like the number of pencil miles you put in is the level of fidelity or accuracy, whatever your goal is, of
Mm-hmm.
coming out. You just got to have the pin time. And but there is a Matthias Lattis in gave this wonderful workshop on Tombow markers that are they're not waterproof. They're the
Mm.
ones that are like water based. And I tell you, I've done graphic recording and notes with these, and then I try and bring like a water based media, and it's like no, because it's just messy and it gets disgusting and wobbly. But if used for good instead of by accident,
Mm.
you can take a regular Tombow on regular paper, activate it with a thin brush of water, and let that spread and flow. And it's like you have an ink based media with the
Interesting.
control of a pen, but the fluidity of ink and watercolor. It's really lovely. So I encourage
Mm.
people to maybe play around with that a little bit.
Mm. Interesting. Really interesting. Cool. Well, these are great tools offerings for us, and we'll of course I'll dig up and I'll get links from Kate and make sure we've got stuff in the show notes so you can take a look at all her stuff and maybe try something new. Um, let's shift now to tips. So this is one of my favorite things. We've even taken to at the end of the season. We gather all the tips together in one episode, so you can listen to them all in one go, and people really like that. So here's how I frame it. It's someone's listening who is into visual thinking, whatever that means to them, graphic recording, sketchnoting, nature journaling, could be anything. But they feel like they've hit a plateau and they need a little encouragement just to go up to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to hear 3 tips for someone who's in that place from you, just to encourage them, to give them inspiration. It can be practical, it can be mindset, whatever you like for those people.
Awesome. Okay. By the way, I love those recap episodes. Those are the ones I listen to
Mm,
over and over because there are so many good tips on there.
yeah.
Um, if you have time, so if you can take some time, which I think any renewal deserves time, like that's the philosophy. But I had an experience once that became an intentional experiment, which is the pen goes dry experiment. I was outside and I was doing some sketching and I lost the lid of my pen, and it was a good pen. I didn't want to I didn't want to lose it and have it just dry out. So I just told myself I would keep drawing and writing and noting and observing and thinking until the pen went dry. And I did. And it took, a couple hours, but it's fascinating like what happens when your goal is to run the pen dry instead of to
Mm,
produce some kind of outcome.
mm-hmm,
And I ended up watching a few videos and like drawing things around the house and taking a walk and drawing flowers, and it was all very random, but it was incredibly freeing. And
mm,
so you might not necessarily want to run a pen dry, that can take hours, but you might say for the next 20 minutes, I'm just going to walk around with my pen and paper and just note, draw, sketch, just visually translate the world. And there's a connection and an embodiment of action with that, I think is really rejuvenating. And you'll never be sad you did it. Like, right? Like you might look at the outcome and be like, whoa, that's crazy. You will never regret doing that because it's this moment in your life of rejuvenation. It can be, I think, mind altering. All right. So that was a long one. Let's do a short one. I love 3 times a charm. Just taking a sketch note that I've done in the past, looking at a different layout pattern or format or someone else's style and doing it 2 more times, trying to make it as different as possible. And to me, that really opens up and refreshes the capture. I fall into, both patterns as well as ruts. And it takes a lot of responsibility off to be doing the content that you know that you've done before and then doing it in a different visual way. It also reinforces that content. I think that's one of the best study techniques ever.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'd say the third one is to find someone that you enjoy, that you don't feel judged by, and just ask about their work and tell them about yours. Like get out of doing the work and talk about the work and reconnect with why you love it, why it was fun, what was hard. That reflection time for as much in our everyday lives. I know that for many years for a sketch note, like I wanted to get it done and I was doing a lot of live note taking. So speed was actually part of my livelihood, right? I was in a conference setting taking notes on behalf of an audience and there's a huge amount of excitement and responsibility with that. But so being able to just reflect and talk through a practice, I think is something that evens out that tempo.
I think that reminds me that was our meeting basically at South by Southwest, as we both came and we shared and we like, here's what I'm doing. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, check this out, right? And we were sharing and listening to what we did and getting ideas from each other. And that was a really memorable moment. I mean, I still remember it, however long, I think it was 09, 2010, something like that, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. So that's a really great, those are 3 great tips. And that one, the last one I like quite a bit, like finding opportunities to connect. And you can even do that over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever technology. It doesn't have to be in person. You can still do those things for people that are not close to you, which helps you build a network of friends that you can rely on. So that's really good advice. Well, thanks so much for those tips. And you know what? We're near the end of the show. We're at the point where you tell us where we can find your work. We can find you on social media and all those great places so we can connect with you and see your work and say hello.
Sure. So I am on Twitter at my handle's Kate Rutter, KateRutter. I try and be first in so I can get that handle on various social networks. So there you can find me on Twitter there. I post periodically. Instagram is where I post visual work still. Not so many reels, but I'll do the flats. And then LinkedIn, please connect if you're interested in visual stuff with me on LinkedIn. Again, it's Kate Rutter. My personal website, my little corner of the internet, which I've had since 1995, is called Intelletto. So it's www or not .intelletto, INTELLETO.com. That is the smorgasbord of past Kate, current Kate, future Kate, and it's called that because that is the word that Michelangelo coined for the inherent intelligence within the material that you're working with. So it's the sculpture already within the stone, and it is the practitioner's role to find it. And that really spoke to me as a way of the role that visual and technology and everything speaks to me. Is there's some truth or greater connection in there, and our job as humans and practitioners is to help each other find it.
That's the what does this thing want to be kind of word, I guess. I remember Stephen King talked about that when he talked in his On Writing book, is the story wants to be something and the characters will tell me what they want to do, and I don't even have to like make things. They'll just tell me, and I'll know when I write things that that's not what I should do. I should do this. So that's really interesting. He almost Stephen King often talks about he's more of an archaeologist than a writer. So he's just like digging things up and then documenting what he sees, right? So that's interesting that objects can have sort of something they want to be, that we can, if we're attuned to it, we can identify it and then release it, which is really cool. That's a
I
great
love
name.
that.
I didn't know that word. I didn't know what that word meant for all these years. So now I know.
Yay. Excellent. All right. Well, this has been an absolute joy and pleasure. And to hang out with you is always super fun. And it's been too long.
Well, it's so good to have you, and thank you so much for all the work you've done for all these years. I know you've been such an ambassador for sketchnoting, especially around the San Francisco area, the Bay Area, with the the SF Sketchnote group and the teaching you've done, and you've gone to bat for me so many times, and I think you're maybe the one that introduced me to the Jack Laws and the Wild Wonder and other places. Like, you've been a real ambassador for me, so thank you so much for all that work you've done and being so kind to me. I appreciate it.
Oh, Mike. Well, back at you, and it's a pleasure. I mean, isn't it wonderful and fun to be part of this amazing community of incredible thinkers and synthesizers and creators? It's really just a joy.
Yeah, it sure is. Well, for everyone who's watching or listening, it's another episode of the Sketchnote Army podcast. Until the next episode, talk to you soon. The Sketchnote Army podcast was created by me, Mike Rohde, and brought to you by Rohdesign Studios. It's produced and edited by Alec Polianis of Amp Creative Studios. The theme music was created by John Schiedermeyer. To support the creation of this show, I invite you to buy one of my books, the Sketchnote Handbook or the Sketchnote Workbook. You can find the books on Amazon, or go to peachpit.com and use the code ROHDE40 for 40% off. Please share this podcast with other visual thinking friends, and be sure to leave a nice rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast listening app so others can find the show.